Welcome, everyone. I knew we were going to have a smaller crowd tonight, but that's okay. We'll go with it as it is. We're in Revelation 17, 18, 17, 1 through 19, 10 is the section. It's the description of the judgment of the great harlot or the great prostitute who rules over the kings of the earth. And I said last week, and if you didn't listen last week, I would recommend that you go get last week's study and do as an overview. If you're not listening to this live, then just pause this one and go do the last one first, because it'll be just such a foundational, establishing a foundation for you that'll be really important, that I think you'd benefit more from doing it that way than you would from listening to tonight's study. But let's open with a word of prayer, and we'll get ourselves started as we get into this very, the sentence I started to say actually was, there's a very complex couple chapters. So it's going to take some work, but we'll hang in there and I think we'll be all right. So Father, we come to you tonight and ask indeed that you would help us to understand the word, that we can apply it to our lives, and that we can apply it to our understanding of the world, that we can apply it to our wisdom and discernment, that we can understand things, that we can learn how to navigate in this world, that we can be transformed by the Spirit and by the power of your word. We ask that indeed that your word would dwell in our hearts richly, and that you would that your word be a light unto our feet and a lamp unto our paths. We thank you for this time now. We pray your blessings upon us. Be with all those who are not with us tonight, for those who are traveling and other with family and celebrations. And we thank you for these opportunities, but we ask that you'll be with us in what we do. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. So, all right. So if you have the notes, let's just kind of go through that. Ask any questions you want as we go. At a few places, we're going to kind of get bogged down in details. I'd rather not. So here's my thought, and that is, let's just kind of get the big picture of it. And if you guys have a question, then ask it. That's fine. But if I try to go through all the details, you're just going to get lost and confused anyways. So I'm going to try to kind of go over more of the big picture thing without getting stuck in all the minutia or all the details. Sorry about that. If English is not your language, first language. And then, but if you have a question, feel free to ask it. That's great. We'll discuss. So here we go. So one way of thinking about this is in regards to the larger, what we call the problem of evil. You know, how could a good God allow all this evil to exist? How could he allow it to continue? And I think we've been answering that in our study by saying, in his love, God is graciously allowing this to exist so that the nations can be brought to repentance. The evil that we see around us, for the most part, is that which the nations bring upon themselves and upon one another, especially the poor and the oppressed. Okay, with that being said. But at the same time, then we look back and we go, you know, when the Nazis were destroyed and defeated, we're like, yes, awesome, right? This is good news. When evil empires fall, it's a time for rejoicing, especially for the sake of the oppressed. And I think you may have, I'm sure you don't remember this, but way back at the beginning of our study, we read a couple of the Psalms, and the Psalms were like, they were rejoicing. They looked at the judgment of God upon the nations of the world as a moment to rejoice, because the nations of the world bring oppression to the poor and to the oppressed. So, okay, so here we go. The judgment of the great Babylon, the great prostitute. It's somewhat ironic. First note that a skeptic might contend that God's unreasonable and evil for allowing evil, unreasonable and evil for bringing such destruction. Yet so often we hear that God's unjust because he allows evil and corruption to persist. That this evil system, Rome, the empire, will not be allowed to remain forever. And telling us about the judgment of Babylon, John wants us to know several things, right? Number one, the judgment of Babylon is just. In the same way that God poured out the bowls, if you remember that, chapter 16, because humanity poured out the blood of saints and prophets, chapter 16, verse 6. And as I noted then, many of your English translations, or many of your English Bibles, I don't know about your Indian Bibles, don't say poured out. It says they shed the blood of your saints and prophets, but it's the same word. The bowls are poured out because they poured out the blood of your saints and prophets, and you've given them blood to drink, and they deserve it. And so also in chapter 18, verse 4, it says, God has remembered her crimes. Therefore, the order goes out. Give to her even as she herself has given, and repay her double according to her deeds. And the cup in which she is mixed twice, mixed double for her. That's the first thing. The judgment of Babylon is just. And remember, the souls on the altar from chapter 6 were like, how long, O Lord, until you bring justice? So that's what this is actually all about. The second thing, and welcome those of you guys that have jumped on. God wants us to know that Babylon's wealth came at the expense of almost everyone else. Recall that historians have estimated that 90% of the empire throughout of people in the empire lived one day at a time and not necessarily knowing where tomorrow's food will come from. And I said 30, 30, 30. 30% live with total food insecurity, the bottom 30%, and not only lacked knowledge of where tomorrow's food was, but probably didn't have enough food for today to have a nourishing meals, right? They were malnourished. Next 30% struggled to get by, but got by. The next 30% got by and probably had a reasonably balanced diet, but they were still hand to mouth day to day. Then you have 7% that lived above the poverty line and managed to live moderate lives. Remember, there's no, for you guys that are Americans, there's no middle class in the ancient world. There's the haves and the have-nots. But this 7% was like, well, at least they have something, and they benefited because they were merchants and sailors, and they got a lot of business. That's what we're going to see in this chapter here, and commerce from Rome, and so they benefited from it. And then the 3% were the elite, and they were really, really wealthy. And obviously there's scales of different wealth there. So, okay. So now, and by the way, even the 7% that what you might want to call middle class, but it's not middle class, they were still at risk if Rome wanted to take away land, if Rome wanted to take away any of their rights, if there's a famine, if there's pestilence, if there's a catastrophe, they still, now they become insecure, right? All right, third, John wanted us to know that Babylon is not eternal, despite her claims, which we'll see in chapter 18. She will face judgment, and her judgment will mean two things. Those who are allied with her will suffer also, and the people of God and their blood will be avenged. So which side of the alley are you going to be on, right? So bear that in mind. Okay, now, in one sense then, I'm sorry, here we go. Of course, the question is, who or what is Babylon? It will be important, as it always is, with the scriptures to discern what John meant, what his reader or hearers, remember one person read it out loud, everybody else heard it, so that's why I say reader and then hearers, plural, would have understood him to mean, and then to discern what this means for us. Discerning this well is critical. It's critical for anything, but especially the book of Revelation and the Bible. Okay, now, some people think, so the popular understanding is that Babylon's some future entity and this is some futuristic thing, built maybe some revived Roman Empire. That's why you often hear evils about the United Nations. And those of you guys in India might not understand what we're talking about, but in America, there's this whole end time scenario that's been drawn up in the last, especially 50 years. And it says, oh, well, Babylon is this ancient, it's built on Rome, so it must be like a European entity that rules. So it's the United Nations, and it's going to have 10 horns, and the 10 horns are 10 kings. We'll see that in chapter 17. And so when the European Union has 10 nations in it, that will be the mark. That's how we know it's the mark of the beast. That's how we know what the beast is, or what the prostitute is. It's that was the whole idea. The beast has 7 heads and 10 horns, and the beast is European United Nations, or Babylon is the economic side of the United Nations, etc. And then obviously some of you might know it went from like, I think 7 or 8 members to like 12 or 15 members and skipped over it. Well, it's going to come back someday. And eventually, and you'll see Britain left and a few other nations leave, and it'll be, it's like, really, seriously, stop, guys. All right. But that's kind of the idea. Some end times scenario in a literalistic sense. Right. Others look at this and say, John was only describing things in the first century and has nothing to do with us today. Now, what I have argued and widely agreed upon in the scholarly community is that John used Rome as the embodiment of all empires in history. So the beast is the empire, and the prostitute is going to be like the economic side of things, the merchandise, the material side of things, the commercial side of things, the economic side of things, the financial side of things, the goods and services, clothes and foods and commodities. And these two are going to be, you're going to see that the prostitute, Babylon, the prostitute is going to be sitting on top of the beast. So they're kind of united and wed together. I've argued that John was describing what was true in the first century as the embodiment of this, but it embodies all empires in history. That's just simply the way all empires work. All right, so does that make sense? Let me know if you have any questions here. And for those guys who just came on, if you didn't get the notes, they're in the chat box. The link is in the chat box. You can get it that way if you haven't gotten them. So it looks like everybody has them okay. So welcome, guys. Karen, John, Jazz, John, and Chris. I don't know if Chris has sound yet, but welcome. So here we go. All right, so we're looking at the notes. So we're about near the bottom of the first page. In one sense, we can understand the accounts of Babylon, the great prostitute, and the bride in light of Proverbs 1-9. I mentioned this last week. And the choice between Lady Folly and Lady Wisdom. Lady Wisdom is identified as the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs contrast between Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. And so wisdom is defined as the fear of the Lord. Folly is defined as going on your own way. It's this came up last week also. It's the Garden of Eden again. Adam and Eve, are you going to choose to listen to the Lord and fear the Lord as a source of wisdom? Because you need wisdom if you're going to rule. Or are you going to choose to rule based on your own knowledge, your own understanding, which if you read the book of Genesis is like Adam and Eve were depicted as children. So they don't have the wisdom that they need to rule very well. Not knowing right from wrong is kind of the idea. Okay, so essentially then, this is the next page. And we'll discuss this in upcoming weeks as we reflect back on the beast and the prostitute. The question is the same as that was Adam and Eve. To whom will you give your allegiance? And another way of saying it is, as we looked at a few weeks ago, in the words of Jesus, no one can serve 2 masters. This is Matthew 6:24. For you either hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And I put that in the notes there. Most English Bibles read either wealth or money, but the Greek is mammon. And mammon extends beyond money to anything we give our allegiance to besides God. So wealth is better than money. So if your English Bible say wealth, that's better than money, but it's more than even just wealth because it also is too limiting. So Barbara Rossing is a great writer, and she has written a popular book on understanding the book of Revelation as a response to the rapture theology, if you're interested. And she says, the audience is called to make a choice. The Babylon and the New Jerusalem visions aim to persuade the audience to come out of Babylon, that's Revelation 18:4, so that they can participate in the New Jerusalem. All right, so come out of Babylon so you can participate in the New Jerusalem. So, all right, are we good so far? Okay, so before we start, let's look at the book of Nahum. I don't think this is on your notes. The book of Nahum. Oh, I need to start that. The book of Nahum, chapter 3, verse 4. Nahum chapter 3, verse 4. So shortly after the book of Daniel, kind of after the book, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum. There you go, in the middle. So Nahum chapter 3, verse 4. I'll read it, so you don't have to worry about finding it. It says this. All because of the many harlotries of the harlot, the charming one, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations by her harlotries, and families by her sorceries. Behold, I'm against you, declares the Lord. Okay, so it's the harlotries of the harlot, the charming one, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations by her harlotries and families by her sorceries. Now, understand this, when we talk about harlot, and this is actually interesting because some people think this is where we go with the great prostitute in the book of Revelation, but the biblical story is that God is married to his people. He's made a covenant relationship with the people of Israel, or the people of God. And that covenant is symbolized as a wedding contract or wedding covenant. It's like a husband and wife. They've gone into contract together. God's the husband, the people of God are the bride, or the wife of the husband, the wife of God. So when we follow after other gods, very common in the prophets, when the people of God go after other gods, they've committed adultery. So you see adultery and sexual immorality running through the prophets. But it's not because Israel was necessarily sexually promiscuous. It's because Israel had adulterated itself with other gods. They had followed after other gods and committed adultery against God. Okay, the book of Hosea obviously is a great example of this. So this is an interesting question. Is Jezebel in the book of Revelation chapter 3, is she actually committing sexual immorality, or is she actually encouraging the people of God to follow other gods? I think it's the latter of them. And I think that's actually the case most often in the New Testament. Meaning when Paul talks about sexual immorality, he's not necessarily talking about actually being sexually immoral, depends on the context. He's talking about following after other gods when you've been wed to the Lord. So, and I think that's the case in the book of Revelation also. So, okay, now We read the first 6 verses last week, and we're going to go over that again. So let's start this week with chapter 17, verses 1 through 3. Revelation 17, verses 1, 2, and 3. If somebody wants to read, go ahead, please.
I can.
Mm-hmm.
Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of sexual immorality, and those who live on the earth became drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns."
Okay. So interesting. I'm not sure what translation was that.
New American Standard 2020.
Oh, it's the new American. Okay, I don't have that one. I only have the old New American. I have that like 95 one. So very good. So because they actually translated as sexual immorality instead of immorality. So and that's what the Greek word is, but I think the context here, it's not actually sexual immorality. It's just kind of immorality. Okay, so now here's the deal. John's told, "Come with me, and I'm going to show you the judgment of the great harlot." Now, if you watch carefully, though, and you keep reading through chapter 17, which we'll do as we go, you're going to find out she's not judged in chapter 17. She's like doing fine. The judgment doesn't actually come until chapter 18, verse 2, fallen is Babylon the Great. And then you have 3 groups that lament the fall of Babylon, starting in chapter 18, verse 9. So chapter 17, in one sense, is a long extended introduction to the harlot Babylon, or the great prostitute Babylon. I'll say the great prostitute. The great prostitute Babylon, which tells you how important she is. If John's going to be told about the judgment of Babylon, and you get a whole chapter, like what is it, 19, 17, 18, 19 verses, excuse me, that describe 18 verses that describe her and introducing us to her. This is important. This is really significant. So, okay. All right. So we've gone over the first several verses here. Let's kind of just roll through our outline, our notes then, and fill in some blanks and stuff like that. So let's see. I put down in the notes. Oh, I need to find the other document. Sorry. Where'd it go? There it is. Okay. I put down your notes here that chapter 19, verses 1, 2, and 3, and we discussed this already. One of the 7 angels on 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come, I'll show you the judgment of the great prostitute who sits in many waters," and he carried me away in the spirit. And that's going to be almost identical to chapter 21, verses 9 and 10. And so we can see that and 21, 9, and 10 is introducing us to the New Jerusalem, the bride, the wife of the Lamb. So there's a contrast between the great prostitute and the bride, the wife of the Lamb. All right, so the first is the judgment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters. Now skip down to verse 15 of chapter 17, verse 15. And we're told, "The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are people, multitudes, nations, and tongues." And notice the fourfold title. So I just put in, you can put anything you want in there, but I said people, if you want to fiddle on the word people or nations or whatever it might be. That she sits on the nations. So here she is, she's sitting on the beast, but she also sits upon many waters. And so that's an indication that she's ruling and in power there. All right, with whom, and then there's going to be 3 groups, but I think only 2 groups are mentioned in verse 2. The kings of the earth committed immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with their immorality. Okay, so the kings and then the people, those who dwell on the earth, and those who dwell on the earth is a way to refer to all people. All right, tell me if I'm going too quickly. Okay, so slow me down if we need to. All right, he carried me away in the spirit, and we've talked about that already before. And he carried me away into a wilderness. Now, this is where we have to stop. And I think we've discussed this before, but this is where we have to stop and go, what does wilderness mean in the biblical story? What does it, there's 2 things to do here. One, what does the word wilderness mean? You know, what are some examples of a wilderness? Anybody know? We may have said this before, and you may remember some examples from your own studies or what have you. What are some examples of the wilderness in the Bible?
Israelites for 40 years.
Yep, Israelites
and Jesus
for 40 years.
40 days.
And Jesus for 40 days. That's right. Yep. So, and there's many other examples, but those are the 2 primary ones. Helen, were you going to add another one?
No.
Okay.
Those were them. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. All right, so those are the two major ones. The Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness. Now, remember, the wilderness for the Israelites was a place of refuge because they escaped Pharaoh. So we think of the wilderness as like only bad. It's not. It's good. It's a place of refuge. In fact, God's in the wilderness with them. It's where Moses meets God up in the mountain in the wilderness. They get the law, and God establishes his covenant. I mean, the wilderness is actually where Israel became a nation state. You might even say a nation state. They were landless still, but nonetheless, they became this nation, this national entity with a defined God and a defined covenant. Here's our law. Here's our code of ethics. So the wilderness is in a sense good. It's also where God gave them manna every day. It's also where God provided water from a rock, and God was with them, a cloud by day and fire by night. So it's a place of God's presence. It's a place of God's provision. It's a place of God's protection. It's where they met God, where Moses at least met God, where they got the law. There's a lot of good things. But the wilderness is also, well, it's a wilderness, and there's no food out there, and there's no water out there, and there's snakes out there, and there's scorpions out there, and there's, back in the day, there used to be lions. I'm not sure if the lions were in the wilderness or not, but they were in that area. I know that. So it's not a safe place. It's not. So you need God's protection. You need to huddle together as a camp and put a perimeter around it and things of that nature. Also, it's also a place in the Bible where they were tested. So the word of testing and Jesus was tested and tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. So it's a place of temptation. Jesus met the devil and was tempted 3 times and things of that nature also. So understanding the imagery of a wilderness is actually really helpful here. So you would ask the question, like, when you see mountain, when you see wilderness, when you see things of that nature, you go, what does this mean in the biblical text? The next thing, however, to ask is, how does John use the word wilderness in the book of Revelation? And it occurs, and I think I put it down in your notes there, 3 times. And I put them down in your notes, chapter 12, verse 6, chapter 12, verse 14, and then here in chapter 17, verse 3. So only 3 times. So let's go to chapter 12. And some of you may remember this, but if you don't, let's look it up. All right, and it's a story about a woman in chapter 12, verse 1. And she's got a child, and she gives birth to the child, which obviously is Jesus. Verses 3 and 4, there's a dragon who sits before the woman. He's going to devour the child. And then she gave birth to a son. And that's verse 5. And he's ascends into heaven, and he's going to sit on the throne and rule. And then 12, verse 6. The woman fled in the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. You're like, oh, see, the wilderness is a good thing. It's a place where the woman flees, and she's protected by God. In fact, she's nourished by God. It's a good, it reminds you of the manna in the wilderness. It reminds you of the water the rock that water came out of. God's providing for them, and God takes care of the woman. But now let's skip on down to verse 13. So I know verse 14 is the verse we want to read, but look at verse 13. When the dragon's kicked out of heaven. So that's the next part, because Jesus dies and rises again, the dragon's kicked out of heaven. He's really upset. And verse 12 says, rejoice, O heavens, but woe to the earth, because the devil's come down to you. That's verse 12. Verse 13 of chapter 12. When the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted, or depending on your translation, might say pursued. And it's probably both words actually work. There's not one or the other that's better than the other. We kind of need them both. He's pursuing the woman in order to persecute the woman who gave birth to the male child. Verse 14. But the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time, from the presence of the serpent. You're like, see, the wilderness is a good place. God, and by the way, the wings of an eagle is a description of God carrying Israel out of Egypt. I carried you out of Egypt on eagle's wings. I think it's Isaiah 40, but I'm not sure exactly what chapter it is. But I carried you out of Egypt on eagle's wings. The eagle's wings are God. By the way, it's not America. So those of you guys in India might go, what? Well, there's people that say America is in the Bible because the eagle's wings are the United States, because our national bird is the eagle, and we carry Israel. And it's like, no, not what's happening here. It's the eagle's wings of God providing and protecting the people of God, carrying her into the wilderness where she might be nourished. But now notice what's happening in verse 13, verse 12. The dragon's kicked out of heaven, and he's really upset, and he has great wrath. Verse 13, he pursues in order to persecute the woman. Verse 14, The wings of an eagle were given to the woman so she can fly in the wilderness to a place where she's nourished. Again, going back to verse 6, she's nourished for a time, enough of time. That's the 3.5 years from the presence of the serpent. But now keep reading. Verse 15, the serpent poured water like a river out of its mouth after the woman. Now stop. I thought the woman was protected by God. Wasn't the woman brought into the wilderness so that she would be protected by God? So that she could be nourished by God from the presence of the serpent? That's what it says. But the very next verse says, the dragon poured water, or the serpent poured water out of its mouth after the woman so they can cause her to be swept away with the flood. Verse 16, the earth helped the woman and opened up its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poureth out of its mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman. Verse 17. And went off to make war with the rest of her children, or her offspring, her children, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So guess what? The wilderness is the place where the woman is. And in one sense, she's protected by God. But in another sense, she's still subject to the dragon's persecution. The dragon chases the woman into the wilderness. And sometimes the earth helps the woman. And sometimes maybe it doesn't. So we have this kind of conflicting imagery of a wilderness being a place of refuge and protection. But we know it's not a good place because that's where the serpents, that's where snakes are and scorpions are. And there's no food out in the wilderness. And there's no place for your sheep and your other goats to have any water. So water has to come miraculously from a rock. And that's exactly what you're supposed to think of the imagery of the wilderness. But now, so that's the first point, right? What does the word wilderness mean in the Bible? Second thing is, how is it used in the book of Revelation? And here's the deal. Only 3 times is it used, wilderness, and twice it's where the woman is, meaning the bride, the people of God, the good woman. So John's carried away in the wilderness to see the prostitute. You're like, oh, that ain't good because that's where the woman is. Now, some will say that the prostitute and the woman are the same thing. I don't think that's the case. And that's this very small group of people. But their argument actually makes sense because if you go to the wilderness to see the prostitute, well, that's where the woman is, and they equate the 2 women. But I don't think that's what's going on. I think you have Jezebel in chapter 3 and the great prostitute in chapter 17 and 18. They're the same. You have the woman clothed with the sun in chapter 12 and the woman who's the bride in chapter 21 and 22, and they're the same. So I think the woman in chapter 12 is the good. It's the followers of Christ and the people of God in the Old Testament and then after Jesus. That's the good. That's a good woman, and it's not the same as the prostitute. But what I think you're supposed to know, though, is, and this is very common what John does, he will use a word only a few times, maybe 2 times or 3 times or 4 times, but only in 2 passages or maybe 3 passages. And he wants you to connect those passages together. He links the passages by using the same words, the same terms, or sometimes the same expression. So, and we'll see this as we move forward. It's a very, very common strategy of John. He does this often. And so when the woman is in the wilderness in chapter 12, and the prostitute is in the wilderness in chapter 17, you are supposed to link them together and go, that's where the woman is. Now skip to chapter 18, verse 4, and I think it'll make more sense. Chapter 18, verse 4, this is the description of the fallen, and fallen is Babylon the Great. And it says, I heard another voice from heaven, this is Revelation 18, verse 4. I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues. We didn't go out to the wilderness to find out where Babylon is. Babylon came out to the wilderness to meet us. And some of us joined Babylon. Does that make sense a little bit? All right.
It does.
Yeah.
But can I ask a question?
Of course, please. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, late. Thanks for having us. But you've throughout this whole study said to focus on the literary perspective, which I think is kind of key because, and you know me, I'm very delineated, but I'm trying to understand. Like, he's not giving you an explanation of the flood, but he in a sense kind of intimates that it came from the Satan. Because if he brought the floodwaters, God was unhappy with all the sin on earth. But if he brought the floodwaters, it's almost as if he released authority for him to do that.
Okay, so that's an interesting interpretation, and it's possible. So what Anthony's referring to is back in chapter 12. It says the dragon poured water out of its mouth like a river after the woman and caused to be swept away in the flood. So the problem with associating that, A, with literal water is the first problem. The second problem is the fact that if you read chapter 12, it doesn't fit the chronology, because the woman in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 is Old Testament Israel. And then verse 5, she gives birth to Jesus. So now after verse 5, we're after Jesus. So you can't have verses 13 and 14 going back to the flood of biblical times, of the Noahic flood. So there's two problems there. Number one is that just the chapter 12 does have a chronology in it, all right? Because chapter 12 is kind of a historical overview of the history of the dragon's persecution of the people of God. So 12 does have chronology in it. Right? It's one of the few places I'll concede that there's chronology. The second thing, though, actually is what comes out of the mouth of the dragon. Now, it totally makes sense that you would assume it's water, and he's like trying to sweep the people of God away. But remember, by the way, the biblical flood didn't sweep the people of God away. They were on the boat. It swept everybody else away. So but if you go to chapter 16, verse 14, I think it is, or maybe verse 13. There you go, verse 13. Revelation 16, verse 13 says, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits that look like frogs. Verse 14, for they are the spirits of demons, performing signs, which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war, the great day of God the Almighty. So if we link those two, if you link the mouth of 12 with the mouth of 16, I think we're supposed to, then it's not actually floodwaters, it's deceptive lies. The dragon's trying to deceive the woman into following after the beast, and to following and to abandon faith in Christ. That would be another way of saying it. And I think that's probably what's happening there. So it's not actually floodwaters, but very, very good idea. Very good and very good question. All right. And does that help? Any other questions or thoughts?
That helps. And I don't want to extrapolate too much.
No,
but
that's fine.
Are you there again? The waters and the oceans, that's chaos. So could you say he's releasing chaos by virtue of him stating water?
Yeah, you could say it that way. Yeah. It's the chaotic, deceptive of the demonic realm. Yeah, that's kind of that's just. But don't literalize water though. That's all in that sense there. Yeah, which makes sense that you would do it. It's just all of a sudden we start looking for them like, okay, no, it's not actually the case here. So, yep. Okay, so here we go. So the judgment of the great prostitute sits on many waters. The kings of the earth committed adulteries with her. He carried me away in the wilderness. And so the fill in the blank, if you haven't figured that out yet, is that the wilderness is where the woman is, where the woman was taken by God so that she might be protected by the dragon, or be protected from the dragon, not by the dragon, from the dragon. Yeah, a little minor mistake there. So, all right, very good. Okay, now the woman is sitting on a beast. And we read the first 3 verses again tonight, if you just joined us. Woman is sitting on a beast. And it's stated that in verse 3 and in verse 18. Let's see, verse 18 says, by the way, the woman whom you saw in verse 18 is the great city that reigns over the kings of the earth, kind of the cut to the chase. She's the great city that reigns over the kings of the earth, but it's not just the city of Rome, it's the commercial side, the commerce side of Rome. It's the material goods, not just the economics and wealth, but the tangible goods, grain, clothes, food, wine, gold, pearls, things of that nature. So, okay. All right, so here we go. So I put down the notes and the next fill in the blank here underneath the letter D. Babylon, the great prostitute, is Rome's economic religious system allied with the state. Okay, and the word allied, working together with the state. But they're going to work together only for so long because they're all beasts and they're demonic. They can't really get along. So it's not going to, it won't be too long till there's a feud. And that's always what happens, by the way, right? Even within nations, we end up feuding and fighting over things of that nature. So, all right, now again, remember, it's hard to describe. So those in America here, we tend to think of politics and religion, and they're 2 different buckets, and they're 2 different things, and never shall the twain meet, right? And those of you guys that are not from America, we always say 2 things that you shouldn't talk about at the family dinner table or at the Christmas table or the Thanksgiving table as religion and politics. Just keep those away. Right? Now, those of you guys in India are thinking, most likely you're thinking, I don't know, but I'm assuming that you're thinking, that doesn't make any sense because you can't separate religion and politics. And in much of the world, you don't separate religion and politics. And by the way, we really don't separate them here either. We just think we do. Okay. And we do to some extent, but not completely. But nonetheless, in Rome, you just can't do that. So you can't go, oh, it's when I say that Babylon is the economic religious system allied with the state, it's because I have to say something, but I don't mean to say that the beast is only the state. It's the empire that transcends the state, and the prostitute is the economic side of things. And you can say like the second beast is the religious side of things, but it's hard to divide all that up, because to participate in the economy, you have to worship the beast. And to worship the beast, you're worshiping the state. And so economics, religion, and politics are all really interspersed, and you just can't really separate them. So I think I've made that point before. So, okay. All right, here we go. Now we're gonna skip the woman's clothes, and we'll maybe discuss that later on. But the clothing, if you haven't figured it out yet, is really important in the book of Revelation. But nonetheless, all right, here we go. So let's continue reading then. So chapter 17, we read the first 3 verses. Let's read verses 4 through 13. Revelation 17, verses 4 through 13.
I got it.
Thank you.
The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly amazed, but the angel said to me, "Why are you so amazed? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will be amazed when they see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Also, they are 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen. One is living and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are united in yielding their power and authority to the beast."
Anthony, just go ahead and read through verse 18 if you don't mind.
They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, "The waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they, excuse me, and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked. They will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire, for God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by agreeing to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth."
Okay, so that was easily the most obvious passage in the entire book. Clearly easy to figure out, almost self-explanatory. I mean, obviously, some of you probably zoned out after about 4 or 5 verses because you're like, I am so lost. Now, again, we'll go through this.
Kings 5 had fallen. One is.
I can. We'll go through this though, but don't worry about all the details too much. So here we go. So let's go look at our notes. So first off, letter E on the notes. She is drunk with the blood of the saints. She's drunk with the blood of the saints. Now I put in your notes, chapter 18, verse 24. And chapter 18, verse 24, and I think we read it last week, also says that in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. So you can look at the 2 verses as both describing the people of God, or you can say she's guilty of the blood of everyone who's been killed. The word slain typically is used for only the people of God, but that's nonetheless. So she's drunk with the blood of the saints. Now, John's like, so letter F, John wonders. He's like, wait a minute. For one, he was told at the very beginning, hey, come here and I'm going to show you the judgment of the great prostitute. And he sees a prostitute and she's like really well clothed. She's got gold and precious stones and pearls. And she's sitting astride a beast and she's got a gold cup in her hand and she's drunk. She's like, okay, hey, this ain't what you told me. You told me you were going to show me the judgment of the great prostitute. And all I'm seeing is a great prostitute who's reveling in luxury. So he wonders, and that might be why he wonders or marvels. And it's difficult to know because what happens next, because the angel it seems like the angel rebukes him. Like, why are you wondering? Now, so there's two ways of going with this. Number one is he's wondering or marveling because he's like, hey, that's not what I was told. You told me she was going to be judged, and yet she seems to be doing pretty well. But it could also be that John's in awe of the woman. He's marveling at the woman, like, wow, and here's the thing to remember. The book of Revelation's an apocalypse, it's apocalyptic. And apocalyptic is a genre of literature that says, I'm going to tell you what really is happening, the way things really are. It's a revealing, it's an unveiling. It's not people think, oh, apocalyptic means to use like really weird language and cover things up so you have to decode it and figure out what it means. No, it's actually the opposite. It means to unveil or to reveal. So notice that in fact, it says that the woman has on her head a name that says a mystery, Babylon the Great. So it's not a mystery. He's telling you what the name is. The name's a mystery, but in the New Testament, mysteries are always revealed. So the book of Revelation is a revealing. This is the way it really is. So we read the book of Revelation and go, okay, guys, why would you follow Satan? He's a dragon with 7 heads. He's clearly evil. He's got demonic beings coming out of his mouth. Don't follow him. And if you keep reading, he's going to go to the lake of fire. Don't do it. That's really easy. But then you realize that Satan's deceptive ways are enticing. And Satan's really good as a deceiver because he actually looks like he's good. As Paul will say, he masquerades as an angel of light. So what John's readers were seeing in reality was Rome as a seductive woman or as something enticing. Let's put it this way. When you go to the store and you're like, oh, I'd love to have, or you see a television show and you see a commercial, you're like, I'd love to have that car. That's what advertisers do. They try to seduce you. They try to get you to go, oh, you want that and you need that. And if you had that, you would have all the beautiful women in the car with you that car comes with, or the good-looking men, right? I mean, that's the way they're trying to seduce us. What John's doing is saying, actually, that advertiser, let me tell you the way it really is. So when we read about Babylon, I think Anthony and I had a comment, if you don't mind me calling you out here, about pictures of the book of Revelation, right? Images. And the images, if you do like Google, images.google, you can find images for all the beast and the prostitute. And they're actually really kind of cool because they're really well done describing what John's, putting in picture what John's describing. But there's a problem because when you look at the picture, you're like, that's evil. I want nothing to do with it. But that's actually not reality. Reality is you want everything to do with it. You want that car, you want that house, you want those clothes, you want that food, you want that commodity, you want that Apple Watch, you want that new computer, we want those things. So that's the problem. So John's describing is like, hey, look, why are you marveling at this woman? Stop. So that's another way of understanding why he's marveling. And maybe he's actually being rebuked. What are you marveling about? So two ways of looking at the statement about marveling. He's either marveling because she's not being judged, or he's marveling because like he's being lured to follow her. Okay, any questions or comments? All right, so the fill in the blank in letter G is, I'll tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her. I'll tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her. Okay, and the word mystery occurs 4 times in the book of Revelation, and I gave you the references to those there. Chapter 1, verse 20, 10, verse 7, and then twice here in chapter 17, verses 5 and 7. All right, so now the next thing is this. As the angel begins to tell John the mystery, don't try to decode. What I mean by that is this. It's got 7 heads. And the seven heads are seven kings. Okay, so the first king is Nero. The second king is, right, the first king is Octavian or Augustus. The second king, right, that's not what if we try to do that, it will not work. Trust me, there are hundreds of books out there and scholarly commentaries out there and articles on, and none of them can make sense by decoding. I don't think that's what's meant to happen. 7 is a number for perfection or totality or completion. That's why I say the beast represents all empires and not just Rome. It's embodying Rome. Rome's embodying all empires. So here we go. The beast was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. Now, the language of was and is not and is about to come up kind of sounds like what? It sounds like something we've heard earlier in the book of Revelation, but it's not quite. It doesn't match up quite. Something's off.
Where Jesus is, he was and is to come.
Yes. Jesus, God, actually, it's usually the Father, the one who is, who was, and who is to come. But notice the beast was and is about to come up, but he's going to go to destruction. So it's a play on that, because remember, the beast blasphemes God, it says in chapter 13. I think it's verse 5. He blasphemes God. Well, he's claiming to be God. He's got 7 heads, right? He's claiming to be God. He was. So the importance of this, so the fill in the blank is, the importance of this is the blasphemous nature. It's 2 words, blasphemous nature. Or you can just put 1 word, blasphemy, if you want there. So, all right. So the beast is blasphemous. It's claiming to be divine. And I think there is some, and I think we discussed this before, but just in case to review, the satanic trinity, the number 666, at least, I think it refers to Nero also, but it may refer to not quite 777, describing the beast in a Trinitarian way of saying the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet represent the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and a satanic perversion of the Trinity. I think you do have that going on in the book of Revelation also. All right, the 7 heads are 7 mountains and
Hey, Rob, real
7 kings. Yep, 1 second. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
No, I find that interesting too, though. But was and is not and is about to ascend. He was within the divine council. He is not within the divine council. And I understand your antithesis to God's description in terms of is and was and is to come. But parallel, am I reaching again?
It's not the divine council here. I don't. Yeah, it's a good idea again. I think this is talking about the beast and not the dragon. And so, and the beast is the empire. It's Rome, and so it's the empire. And so, and this is really deep, and I'm not going to go down this path too far, but there was very prevalent in the Roman world at this time a myth about Nero that he wasn't actually dead. And this is very much what John's playing. The language is almost unmistakable. The idea, when Nero commits suicide in 68 AD, not long after he commits suicide, the legend started circulating around that Nero wasn't actually dead. There was a couple different legends. One of them said he had gone to the east, to the Parthians, Iran, basically, right? And he was going to come back with the Parthian army and defeat Rome. But another one's like, no, he's going to come back and restore and rule over Rome. That's probably what John is getting at when he says he was, and then he is, because he's actually still alive, and he's about to come up, and he's going to come back. And there were a couple, actually, Nero imposters that got away with it for a little while because they look like Nero, and they got away with it. One, I think there was one in 69, and there was one in the early 80s. So Nero committed suicide in 68. There's one in the early 80s. So that's how long. So this tradition's going out there, and it's abundant in the literature as well. I think that's what John's playing off of. So, which just reinforces the 666 idea that refers to Nero. So, yep. Okay. So here we go. So the letter I, the fill in the blanks are mountains and kings. The 7 heads are 7 mountains and 7 kings. Now, there's no question, I don't think there is anyways, that the 7 mountains, that it's clear this is Rome. If you're not aware, Rome is called the 7-hilled city. And the Greek word for mountain is the same word for hill. Just translate it whichever way you want. So you can translate this as she sits on 7 hills if you want. That's fine. It's the same word. The 7 hills, and Rome is a 7-hilled city. And this is widely known. There's no question that that's what John's playing off of. But she's also 7 kings. Now, the importance of that is not to go, oh, this head represents that mountain, this head represents that mountain, this head represents that mountain. And then say, and then this head represents that king, and then this head represents that king. That's not what's happening there. Mountains and kings are almost interchangeable in biblical imagery. Remember, Eden was on a mountain. And so obviously the kings of the empire, the kings of the world are also described as mountains. And so I think it's a description, I'm not certain of this, I think it's in Ezekiel. The description of the destruction of Babylon is being described in the sense of this mountain being thrown into the sea. That could be Tyre. If it's not Babylon, it could be Tyre. I'm pretty sure it's in the book of Ezekiel. But so what's actually the significance here is that mountains and kings are both actually interchangeable imagery, one for the other. So he's certainly identifying Rome with the 7 mountains. That, no question. So now we have 7 kings. And what's important is not to parse the 7 kings out, even though John kind of seems to do so. He's like, well, the 5 have fallen, one is, the other's not yet come. Because then you have a problem, because the beast also is an 8th king, and yet he's one of the 7. How does that work? And the answer is it doesn't work, because it's not meant to work. And that's the problem. And I have a chart in my notes. I just didn't paste it into your outlines there. All the different theories that have been postulated out there to say, well, because the idea is that Nero is one of them. So Nero is the 8th king, but he's also one of the 7. And none of them work. You take taking emperors of Rome, none of them work. They just don't work. No matter where you start, no matter where you end, it's not going to work. So to make these 7 kings, 7 actual kings of the Roman Empire doesn't work. What's important is there's 7. And 7 represents totality, completion. This is all the empires, right? So it could be 4 empires, like the 4 beasts, but now John's using the number 7 to do, I think, to do the same thing. So if that makes sense. So here we go. The woman sitting on a beast, and the beast is blaspheming, claiming to be divine. The beast represents all the empires in history, and the woman's sitting on it. So, by the way, number 1 on the fill in the blank under I, mountains symbolize kingdoms in the Old Testament. Mountains symbolize kingdoms in the Old Testament. I'll go ahead and turn and look at Jeremiah 51 if you want. Jeremiah 51, 25. Oh, there you go. The other reference I was thinking of, actually. So verse 24, Jeremiah 51, verse 24, I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea for all the evil that they have done in Zion before your eyes. Because, Lord, behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain, who destroys the whole earth. That's verse 25. Who destroys the whole earth, declares the Lord. I will stretch out my hand against you and roll you down from the crags, and I'll make you a burnt out mountain. There you go. Babylon is a mountain. So Jeremiah 21, verse 20, Jeremiah 51, verse 25. All right, you also have that in Daniel and Zechariah 4. All right, 7 mountains then support 7 kingdoms. I think, and there, number 2, 7 is figurative for qualities of fullness or completion, represents the totality of all the evil world's empires. And I put question mark. I think that's probably what's going on. Okay. All right. Now, any questions? Okay. Just lost in the confusion of it all. Right. Here we go. So I'm going to try to keep just highlighting the key points here. Here we go. The letter J, the beast which was and is not, as an 8th king, and is yet one of the 7th. The 10 horns are also 10 kings, and they haven't yet received a kingdom. And that's where people get the United Nations from. It's like, stop. Okay. And they'll reign for 1 hour. And that's why, by the way, a lot of Christians, they oppose anything the United Nations does. The United Nations can never do anything good, because they're the evil horns of the beast in the book of Revelation. It's like, that's not what's going on here. So all empires are the evil horns of the beast, not just the United Nations. And it doesn't mean that they always do evil also. All right, they reign for 1 hour. The time frame is simply meant to say not very long. It's not a little, obviously it's not a little time frame, because I mean, really 10 kings that reign for 1 hour. It's simply, it's a lot less than 3.5 years. Right? It's 1 hour. Remember in Smyrna, the church in Smyrna in Revelation 2, you're going to have tribulation for 10 days. So all that's meant by 1 hour is it's not a very long time frame. Okay, and I put some references to Daniel there. If we need to go back to Daniel, we can there. So here we go. Letter L, They, the 7 heads and the 10 kings, and the seven heads who are kings, and the 10 horns who are kings. So that's who the they is. The 10 horns and the 10 kings. I'm sorry. The prostitute and the beast give their power and authority. The prostitute and the horns give their power and authority to the beast. So the beast aligns itself with all the world powers. And then what do? Well, then they make war. Letter M. They make war. This is the fill in the blank. The woman, the beast, and the kings of earth make war against the lamb. Every single time you see a war in the book of Revelation, it's against Jesus or against the people of God. It is not a cosmic battle in the fields of Armageddon waged by the empires of the world against some revived state of Israel. That's not what's happening. Never. Every single time war is described in the book of Revelation, it's against Jesus or his followers, because to wage war against Jesus is to wage war against his followers, because you actually can't wage war against Jesus because he's sitting at the right hand of the Father. So how do you do it? You wage war against his followers. That, and I wrote a chapter in my book called Understanding the New Testament and the End Times on Armageddon. Armageddon is the war that's been going on since the beginning of time against God's people. You can say it's the war that's been going on since the resurrection of Christ, if you want. That's fine. But I think you can extend it to the war that Satan's always, Armageddon is what was happening in the Garden of Eden. Right? Armageddon is the war that's waged, Egypt enslaving Israel, Armageddon. The Babylonians conquering Israel, it's kind of Armageddon because as well as the battle. So when we hear about the Christians, the 400 churches that were in Manipur that were destroyed a couple weeks ago, that's Armageddon. That's Armageddon. When Christians say, well, the book of Revelation is not happening because Armageddon's not happening. It's like, no, read the news. It's happening. This is what's being described here. It's always the war against God's people. So, all right, let me finish up. I kind of want to get to chapter 17, and we're almost there. So we'll finish that. And if you have any questions, we'll take them there in a minute here. All right. So the Lamb, it says, and his followers will destroy. So let me see what the fill in the blank is there. Oh, there's no fill in the blank. Will overcome them. Revelation 17, verse 14. Because he's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So the Lamb will overcome them. There's that word overcome. Because he's the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. And those who are with him are the called and the chosen and the faithful. There you go. So the war is against the Lamb, but it's also against those who are called, chosen, and faithful because they're with the Lamb. All right, now we already discussed verse 15. So here we go, verse 16. The harlot is destroyed in verses 16 through 18. And the fill in the blank is by her allies. Notice what happens. It says, the 10 horns, which you saw, verse 16, and the beast, they're going to hate the harlot. And they're going to make her desolate and naked. I'm going to eat her flesh and burn her up with fire. Because God's put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. Oh, by the way, the woman that you saw is a great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. So this is empires imploding against one another, and parts of the empires violently waging war. This is what empires do. They wreak havoc and destruction on other empires and other peoples, and they also wreak havoc and destruction upon themselves. Okay, so now we're going to read about the destruction of Babylon, and that's next week. Okay, very good. So chapter 17 is this long introduction. Let's see if we can make it clear. Babylon is the commercial, material side of the empire that's allied with the empire, and obviously with the false prophet, that is ultimately waging war against Jesus and the people of God. Therefore, but she's also in the wilderness where we are. And therefore, she's enticing and she's luring us to come follow her ways, but she's blasphemous, or the beast is blasphemous, and because she's allied with the beast. So therefore, come out of her, my people. Do not participate in Babylon. Because why? Because Babylon's fallen, or she will be fallen ultimately at the end. Okay, so we'll look at that in chapter 18 next week. Any questions? That was so easy. I don't even know why I spent my time explaining it. I should have like 3rd grade Sunday school class here. All right, there's no question. This is certainly one of the most complex chapters in the New Testament, if not in the entire Bible. So Okay. No questions? No comments?
I have a
Yeah,
question.
please.
Is John writing this in such a mystically hidden way so as not to be, I don't know what the word would be back then, but not to be arrested and
Right.
Killed for sedition against the state of Rome? So he's trying to get the message out, but in a way that...
So that has been proposed a number of times. I've even held to that view at different times, but it doesn't seem to be necessary. So I think John's using apocalyptic language because that's simply the language that he's using. I don't think he's trying to be covert, right? So because the government doesn't care. The government's not going to read this. They may find out what you guys are, but so it does make a lot of sense. That's why I've kind of subscribed to that idea before, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily true. It could be. But
he's saying some pretty nasty things about Rome. We can't just say it. I mean, if he actually said it, they wouldn't like that.
That totally makes sense. I agree. Yes, totally makes sense. Yep.
Especially Nero too.
Yeah, well, Nero, yeah. So Nero's dead, but I date the Book of Revelation. So we have a podcast that's coming out June 12th with one of the leading scholar on the 7 churches in the Book of Revelation. And he believes in an early date in the Book of Revelation. He thinks it was written around 69, AD 69. And Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. So just after Nero's death. I think Revelation was written maybe in the 80s or 90s, if not mid 90s or something like that. I think it was a late date, and I don't think we know the exact date of it. It could have been late 80s, but most likely sometime in the 90s there. So Nero's gone. The legends are still there. John's playing off those legends. So it goes either way. So, yep. All right. Somebody else?
Not to diminish Helen's perspective, but John's, if I'm understanding all of this correctly in the proper context, John is speaking the language of the Old Testament, but it's not only Rome here. He's talking government throughout time.
Yes.
So Babylon is going to be every empire that arises, every Zionist outlook that's trying to do colonialism, imperialism, whatever it is. It's using the same format, is it not?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say a Zionist outlook, but yes, you're right. Yeah. Any colonial, not just any imperial. It's just imperialism, right? And the problem with imperial is we tend to think oh, the United States is not imperialistic. Like, yes, it is. Okay, but we tend to think that maybe smaller nations in Rwanda aren't imperial. They all are. So imperial power is just another way of referring to nations and those who rule over them. How big or small they are is irrelevant. It's all nation states, but not all nations are nation states. The language is, we're kind of stuck with that, but yeah. So yeah, it's all of the above. But remember, for John, all he knew was Rome.
Right. I chose to use Zionist because in your podcast, Tony, he used that word in terms of expansionism. And that's the first time I heard ever aligned that way, because all of us, or most of us at least, I think, reflect Zionism in the Israel state, but he applied it across the spectrum and to every colonialistic outlook we've seen through history. So
yeah, I wouldn't use it that way though, right? Okay. And I have to kind of be kind to guess, so a little bit also, but Zionist is specifically a colonial enterprise that says the Jewish people have a right to the historic homeland. So that could be a Jewish Zionism, and then there's Christian Zionism that says none of the Jews have a right to that historic homeland, but it's a biblical right. That's Christian Zionism. So, and I would use Zionism to refer just to that. So, yep. Okay. Very good. All right. Any other questions? So the people on Facebook Live and YouTube Live and YouTube want to hear your questions. So because they probably have the same ones. Like, I want to ask a question, I can't do it. Would somebody please ask? So,
well, in that case, I do have another one.
Okay, please.
Having listened to your podcast, I found them fascinating, and we're 8 hours on the road, so we're listening to a lot of stuff.
Good.
We listened to both the one of the Messianic guy, and then we listened to Tony in that order. But then we also listened to podcasts from the Bible Project in regards to cities. Fascinating connection that's probably out of context, but that we kind of saw, and that he talked about in the cities, that when people gather in cities, the worst of humanity perpetuates itself because we're all gathered in one. but that God saw that happening. And from the beginning, he was so gracious. He didn't want to just wipe us out. He had to, I think the word they used a bit was acquiesce. This is my bride. How am I going to work this out with my bride instead of wiping everybody out?
Right.
And they also made a reference to the Old Testament where the flesh cried out from the ground, which when he said that, it was like, holy cow, this light bulb came on after listening to your guy talk about, the Palestinians didn't follow the early agreements in 38 or 37 and throughout time, and that they gave them opportunity to take the land, but they didn't take it. So that when the Jewish settlers came in, it was the fallback nature of humanity to want to expand that territory and march in and take the other's property.
Right.
But then your Tony talked about how that process, even though they didn't agree to it, they couldn't agree to it because it didn't give them anything, the Palestinians. So if the fallback nature of the settlers is coming in and is such to just, they're again expand in a colonialistic outlook, we can't justify that fallen nature. Wrong is wrong. And it seemed like he was standing by the fact that it's okay to do that because it's human nature. Well, that's not honoring God.
I lost you right there at the end. Say it again. What do you mean?
Okay, the Messianic guest you had,
Michael Brown. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Hey, Michael Brown.
Michael Brown. I'm sorry, Michael Brown.
Yep, that's fine. Yep.
When they went ahead and took over the land of the Palestinians, it was just a colonialistic outlook, but it's it's a fallback of human nature of what we do.
Right.
Well, there again, that's not God honoring, and that's leading the flesh to cry out in itself. It's a direct violation of the Old Testament. So you can't say that's a justification for his stance on saying that everything else is anti-Semitic. I think what you're saying and what a lot of us are saying is accountability. God holds us accountable. So you act inappropriately and you lead to an action that causes the flesh to cry out from the ground. Take a look at yourself and say, wait a minute, we're not doing this right.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. And the American colonial enterprise is also guilty as well. Right. Yeah. We are very, very guilty of not only the blood of the indigenous peoples, but then we brought over slaves and did the same thing to them. So it's like, doubly guilty. So yeah, very good. All right. Anybody else?
What is the third one he was referring to? I got the two podcasts from the two different guys, but what was the other thing?
Oh, so the Bible Project podcast. So the Bible Project podcast is a phenomenal, it's like the second best podcast in the world. Okay. But they're doing a series on the city right now. And I think we discussed this back when we were doing the book of Genesis study. I'm like, cities are always bad in the Bible. The only time it's ever good is the redeemed city of Zion or the New Jerusalem. And so they're hitting it and doing an excellent job of it. And it's like, so they are saying the same stuff in the Old Testament that I'm saying about the book of Revelation, by the way. It's just, it's crazy. So it's an excellent series. Okay. All right. Hey, let's let these guys go. Have a good night. Thanks guys for joining on Facebook Live. Again, remember the podcast on determinedtruth.com has a new series starting on the book of Revelation. We're on chapter 1, I think should go live next week. I think it is. So if I think that's where we're at. And then we have, or maybe it was this week. And then
it was this week.
This week. Okay. Then I have a devotional guide that's also available on the determinedtruth.com. Just click on the blog. And then my blogs are also discussing the book of Revelation. And so all those resources are out there for you. I encourage you to jump in. If you want to be part of the Zoom Bible study or to ask questions, send me an email. Let me know what your questions are. If you want to be part of the Bible study, then send me an email with your email address and we'll get you connected. So take care.